I'm Poul Holm. I'm a professor of environmental history at Trinity College, Dublin in Ireland. And what I'll be talking about is how important the ocean is to us. Fish is good for us, we know, for our health. Humans are not good for ocean health. We have learnt over the years that really we are in dire straits with regards to fish populations. We have hit a ceiling. The oceans simply will not yield more. What does that really matter for us as human beings and as ecologists and as historians? I'll try to address all of that in my talk. It's good to be back. It's my 6th or 7th visit to Sydney, so I feel really at home here. And apologies to perhaps a few of you in the audience who will actually have heard some of the stuff that I'll be going over here, because shifting baselines is, as Jyoti introduced, is clearly a basic concept that's been shaping our thinking about oceans for the past 20 years almost now. So a lot of the stuff will be pretty basic, and that's why in my presentation I've sort of tried to take a very simplistic approach. I want to bring everybody up to speed. So I'm talking really to the newcomers more than to the people who've been in the field for a very long time. So apologies to those of you who think that my approach is silly. I will open by just stating what is the problem with the oceans, and then I will speak to those of you who are the environmentalists or the ecologists in the audience, speak about how biology is changing its perception of time. I'll then move on to say what are the ecologists doing to us historians? How are you influencing how we think about the past? Those notions are very simple. And then in the last half of my talk, I will really try and complicate matters. I will try and speak to the nitty-gritty of how we actually try and grapple with these events in the past. And in the perspective section, I will look to the future and talk about how do we use history. So that's what you can expect over the next 3/4 of an hour. So let me start by stating the problem. And you can state the problem in many ways, but I think this is one of the scariest pictures that I can think of in terms of what we're looking at here. Obviously, the red is coming out, but these are orange roughies. And these fish only turn orangey when they're probably dead. They really hit our tables in the 1980s. They became extremely popular, a global restaurant item, especially in America, a little later in Europe, certainly in Australia and New Zealand, and very tasty, and we ate a lot of them without thinking too much about it. Just a new wonderful resource coming out of in the early days out of the Southern Ocean. Later we've been discovering this species in other places as well. But it only dawned on science as we were eating into this resource that these species take a very long time to do what they do in terms of regenerating themselves. They live in cold waters, and therefore they live for a long time. They lead a sedate life, you might say, down at the seamounts of the deep ocean, and it takes them about 30, 40 years to mature, and they have a life expectancy of upwards of 150 years. So if they lead that tranquil life and suddenly are hit by fishermen coming to visit not only once, but twice, 3 times, 4 times. Once you've got your GPS, you know where the fish is and you can hit them, and you can easily fish out a population that's living around the seamount. And if they live around seamounts, of course you will want to know where's the next seamount, so you begin this ocean exploration of plotting seamounts in the deep sea. Even oceanographers do not have a complete picture of seamounts of the deep ocean. So the fishermen were actually doing the discoveries. And they were hitting these populations before we even had an understanding of the ecology of the species. So we were basically eating our way into a resource without knowing what we were doing. And of course, within 20 years, we were looking at a species which was in really dire straits, a real problem of near extinction of a species, because they simply had a lifespan which was not in tune with the hectic life cycle of modern day fisheries. So that's definitely a problem, but it's only one of the many, many problems that have sort of beset us, and which really dawned on us from the, I need to point there, there we go. From the mid-90s, we really were looking at stagnating returns on the fisheries from the world oceans. The oceans will simply not yield more to us, even if we invest heavily, as we do, in capital expenditure on fishing vessels, in new gear. There is simply no more resources out there for us. So we have hit a ceiling in terms of wild captures. Even if we innovate and discover new areas, it is extremely unlikely that we will be able to push above the upper boundary of certainly no more than 100 million tons per year that we can get out of the world's oceans. So in very real terms, we are looking at a ceiling. I visited Taiwan last year, went to the fish docks, and one of the things that struck me is look at these monkfish here, which are being marketed, and look at that woman's foot. She's not a big woman, I tell you. These are very, very small monkfish being marketed. That's scary. They really should be this size. And it doesn't even take a lot of modern equipment to really hit the ocean hard. You just need to be very determined. Then you can do it even using quite old-fashioned technology, like here in Qingdao in China. You just need to be enough humans out there. So the ocean problem in terms of the human perception is this one. That over the past century, we have been able to increase our intake per person year by year without thinking too much of it. In the first half of the 20th century, per capita consumption increased rapidly. Then there was a bit of respite to world fish populations because of the Second World War, and then we built up our extractions quite rapidly in the last 50 years. We're looking now at 16 kilograms per adult across the globe, which is good news in some ways. In terms of human health, this is really good news, because that's about the recommended daily intake, 50 grams per person of fish protein. So it's a healthy diet to us. And of course, if the world was an egalitarian place, we would all have nutritious diets. Of course, some of us get more than the 50 grams, and some of us in, say, in West Africa used to have fish, but we no longer have fish in West Africa because it's all marketed to Europe in that particular case. So there are problems of inequality of distribution, but overall we're looking at really a healthy global human nutrition. The problem is it won't last with the projected world population growth of humans to about 9.2 billion people in 2050. We are looking really at a decrease of wild catch fish per human to a level of about 10 kilograms per person. Now that's not a scare story. That's simply a projection based on the fact that we know that the ocean will not yield more, and we humans are getting more and more on this planet. So that's not going to change. This is, as far as a historian who would go, I'm sort of very skeptical of any projections into the future, but this is pretty certain. This is how the future will be like. This is what we are looking at. So of course we can hope for technological solutions, and aquaculture is certainly a possible solution. We heard yesterday some stories of successes and failures in aquaculture. Obviously, it's very contentious. I won't go into marine aquaculture too much, but I would say, well, definitely aquaculture will be part of the solution. I'm not sure it'll be a full solution anyway. But let me turn to the question of ecology then. As Jody said, the notion of shifting baselines was introduced by Daniel Pauly as a theoretical statement that we humans have very short memories, and we will pretend that what we know as the usual experience of our childhood is what is normal, what we will expect. And of course, that's not true, because our parents, our grandparents would tell us that actually the world looked very differently in their time, and we would say, yeah. And that's how we react. We need to make our own experiences, our own mistakes, and we'll learn from them. So as we get older, we'll get wiser, less innovative. That's the human experience. And it's fine. The only problem is that nature will respond not to the individual experience, but will respond to the intergenerational impact of human onslaught. And the ecologists are realizing this. And one of the pictures that really has changed people's perception of the long-term impact of change in the ocean is this one, published by Lauren McLennan, who had the good idea to go to a yachting company in Key West, which has for the past half century taken people on fishing voyages, and obviously people come home with their trophy fish. They will have their pictures taken in front of this big catch, and they will be very proud. And you can see that they are proud in 1958, killing these big ones, and in 2007, killing these big ones. There's definitely a change here, which is perceptible to anyone. That's the changing, the shifting baseline syndrome in your face. That what we see today and what we pride ourselves on today is not what they would have even considered 50 years ago. Now, not only are the fish getting smaller, some of them don't live there anymore. Sturgeon in the 1880s were marketed big time in Northern European fish auction halls, put on display here in 1885 in a matter of just a couple of decades before World War I. They were largely gone from the North Sea. In my own experience, I started out as a museum curator. One of the very first items I got hold of was a sturgeon net in this North Sea fishery museum where I worked. And I thought, what on earth is that? Because there's no sturgeon. That's silly. Why would you call it a sturgeon net? Well, it was used the last time in 1925. After that, we had oral records that they just gave up. There was no more sturgeon to be had. In the Gulf of Maine, off the coast of northeast USA, of course we had the cod fisheries. One of the traumatic experiences of diving into past history is that we know now that there used to be so many more cod than there is today. Here's the established scientific knowledge of total cod biomass in the Gulf of Maine, as established by scientists by annual observation through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And they established that probably a good conservation target would be to try and secure that there would be a total cod biomass of around 100,000 tons. And that was the established notion of the fisheries management until a group of historians and ecologists led by Andrew Rosenberg utilized 3,000 logbooks which had been handed in the 1850s because the skippers would get a premium if for their efforts in developing the cod fishery, if as proof they just handed in their logbooks. It was not to try and have any kind of tax inspection or anything. Actually, by just producing your logbook, you would get a reward. So there was no incentive for these skippers to try and do anything about the figures. These figures can be trusted as true records of what they actually did. And once the historians and ecologists had worked their way through the 3,000 logbooks, they established that the true historical cod biomass would be 1.2 million tons. So this has influenced conservation policies in the Gulf of Maine. It is no longer possible to be under the shifting baseline syndrome of the world as it used to be in the 1970s is probably the best of all worlds. We know that in the past it looked very differently. And actually, as we've gone through historical records, we realize that more and more of the species out there have gone commercially extinct, not in very recent years, but actually even in the 19th century or early 20th century. So that's been quite a revelation, that it's not the onset of modern trawling that's doing this. We actually did it quite well using pre-industrial technologies, pre-steam, just using traditional technologies. That was quite sufficient as long as we were many enough. And basically what we've done is take out the big fish first and then fish down the food web, another of Daniel Pauly's catchy phrases, fishing down the food web. So that's the ecologists turning historical. How about historians? Are we experiencing a sea change? On Wednesday, of course, we heard Ian McCalman sort of bemoan the fact that no, we historians really don't want to get our feet wet. It's not like we are really developing maritime history in a big way, but there are a few of us out there, and we are an increasing crowd, I would say. So a lot of stuff is happening. Over the past 10 years, well, going to 15 actually, we have established a network of an interdisciplinary effort of historians and ecologists looking at regional examples of historical fisheries, and we developed interdisciplinary collaboration on world whaling, on regional efforts in Southeast Asia, in the Caribbean, the Gulf of Maine, in Northern Europe, the Mediterranean, South Africa, and so on. And what we're doing is really looking into a very eclectic source of information. Some of it will be contained in large monasteries, like this northern Russian monastery, which basically owned the White Sea fishery and had these fantastic records of what they took out of the sea for 300 years. Other sources of information is like this artificial reef of queen conch from the Caribbean, which tell a story of a couple of hundred years of indigenous Indian extractions from the Caribbean. Or Northern Europe, small fishbone out of the throwaways of the big cities can be sifted through and made tell a story. And of course we have the logbooks as well, the skipper's meticulous notes about every day's events. So all of that can be pieced together in a story which will tell us about historical change. And in order to grasp the enormity of change, it's useful for us to look at what was the return on your effort. The catch per unit effort tells a really powerful story. So contrast this 17th century Dutch herring fishery. It took 12,000 men to land herring to the equivalent of about 50,000 tons. Today it takes one vessel and 8 men, not to land 50,000, because they could actually land more, but that's the allowed quota. The annual quota of that one vessel is 50,000 tons. So there you have it. Technology is really shifting the human impact. We have worked backwards through herring records to try and establish in the European North Sea the landings, the returns of these efforts. So here we have 400 years of herring landings established using Dutch, that's the orangey, Scottish, the light blue here, Swedish, the dark blue here, and other countries like Norway, Denmark. Archives to try and build a combined story of how much fish did we actually extract from the North Sea. And we're looking at a picture which actually tells us that by 1870 we were catching in the region of 200,000 tons of herring per year, and contrast that to today's total allowable catch. That's been established as a safety margin for the fisheries in Northern Europe over the past 15 years, and it's never been above 300,000 tons, and it's been down to 150,000 tons. So even by 1880, we were fully able to meet that sort of safety threshold. So for the past 130, 40 years, we've actually been in excess of what would be safe biological limits. We're also realizing that actually as we go back, we can work out that our interpretations of past civilizations actually have been sort of blinded to the fact that fish is an important source of human nutrition. If you read sort of classical scholarship about ancient Rome or ancient Greece, you will very likely search in vain for any mention of fish. And if you do find a mention of fish, you will learn that the Romans didn't fish because they didn't have very advanced technology, and therefore clearly they couldn't impact the Mediterranean in any big way. That was the established notion until about 10 years ago. In 2004, the very first study came out which established that in the Straits of Gibraltar there were these enormous fisheries going on, which were probably landing in excess of 100,000 tons per year from the Western Mediterranean. Similarly, the Greek fishery in the Black Sea would have been of similar proportions. So again, we're realizing that actually human impacts on the life histories of the ecology of the Mediterranean probably is a very ancient origin. For 2,000 years we have really shifted the baselines. Closer to home, we've also looked at Indonesian waters, and trepanging, of course, the sea cucumber, is one of the ancient fisheries which has always had a huge Chinese market because of the perceived benefits of sea cucumber to your sexual health. And if we look at how the fisheries have developed in the Indonesian Sea, we can see a story of serial depletion. We're simply hitting one place after the other really quickly and developing a fishery which by the before Cook's time is hitting northern Australia. And of course, Cook was not the first non-Australian here. These fishermen were actually trading with Australians and getting them involved in trepanging in the 17th century, in the 1680s. We have documentation for their presence. So serial depletion is part of human globalization, of movement and of migration. We've been really forcing ourselves to discover these resources quickly. And of course, trepanging is now a global effort. That story of serial depletion goes on and on and on, and Chinese fishermen are now heating the Western Atlantic big time in search for sea cucumber. So, as a historian, I would say, well, what the basic lesson of looking into past fisheries is really that humans count. The big driver of what we take out of the oceans is how many are we? Because we can work out in rough measures how many kilograms per year we will be eating and relate that to estimated human populations, and then you have a fairly safe estimate of how much fish did we take out of the sea. So as we look at this diagram from 5000 BC through 180 here, 1500 AD, 2000, and the projected 2050, we are looking at a calculated global aquatic consumption which is relentlessly increasing until we hit that ceiling which we have now, and therefore the oceans will not yield more. So in historical terms, this seems like, historians and ecologists can easily team up. We can talk together. We are basically getting the same message out of this. I promised it's not as easy as that. But it's good to know that actually we do have findings. We have established a good basis of dialogue between historians and ecologists. That's really important. But of course, we get frustrated. Ecologists will want to do their statistics and their modeling. They will try and push us. And we have to say, well, the historical evidence is simply not available for that kind of questions. The historians will ask all sorts of weird questions, which the ecologists will think, really, give us a break. So the problem is that the world is really complicated. If we look at this picture of Bruegels from the 16th century, you are looking at a guy who is actually presenting us with the problem as it is. We are, as humans, of course, eating down the food web. But the food web itself is, of course, an intricate maze of relationships. The ocean dynamic and the weather, climate, all of that will impact on what's out there and how it's changing. So as we work out our models, we realize that it's not simplistic. Actually, in order to really comprehend what's going on, we need to know the abiotic, the biotic, the economic, the social, cultural, political drivers of what's going on in the ecosystem. There's so much going on, both on the supply side and on the demand side, that actually, as we look into it, it becomes too complicated. It becomes really impossible to get all of this into your head, and even sophisticated computer models will actually not really help you. To try and illustrate my point here, I'll just make this analogy with the electromagnetic spectrum. So the electromagnetic spectrum is, of course, visible to the human eye. We can see colors. So we are able to perceive the electromagnetic spectrum. It's an everyday occurrence. That's actually what we use for our own observational skills. And of course, we use another part of it for our voice. But most of the electromagnetic spectrum is completely hidden for us. Some of us will have a vague sense of what infrared is, and we can use it, and we can even have some experience of the infrared actually being quite helpful in trying to support us in navigating. And some of it will be really very friendly to us and welcoming. Radio, TV signals, we know about that. Some of it is just invisible and perhaps of no consequence to us, the very long waves. Some of it may be helpful to the experts, the X-rays, and some of it will simply be dangerous and will kill us instantly if we're exposed. But we don't know, we don't observe, we don't see, so it's hidden to us. It's not part of the everyday experience. Therefore, we don't, in our common day language, we act as if it's not there. And we turn on television and radio, not really realizing that it's part of the same everyday occurrence as just looking through your eyes. The human ocean spectrum is a bit like that. We certainly see that we fish. That's observable, and we get the products. But we don't really see that our removals influence how many fish there are. It's really difficult for us to understand that climate may cause change, and the geophysical processes are on such a long time scale, and it's so complicated that we sort of get lost and we don't really think about it. It's really complicated for us to understand that human preferences may actually influence all of that. And to ecologists, it's a real worry that historians always want to talk about human preferences, about culture. Why would you want to introduce the culture thing now? Can we not just talk about the more safe stuff that we really can observe? Because how can you measure culture? It's not measurable, is it? Instrumentation will not help you. That's really not our thing. We want instruments. We want indicators. And give us some safe indicators, we can talk about that. And of course, as interactions become more and more quickened and the pace intensifies, we have energy flows across trophic structures in the ecosystem, but also across human societies. All of this happens at timescales and rapidities, which are sometimes totally just surprising to us. How did that happen? Suddenly, there's an ecosystem regime shift, or cultures change completely. One day the Soviet trawlers are out there, the next day they're gone. And things happen also in stuff which we really have no experience of, like genetics, which we would assume as historians to be a very safe field of long-term, of longevity, and suddenly you have genetic change, and what is that? Can species really change like that? So all of this is hidden to our human experience, and that's the problem of the oceans, that what we see is not what's going on, and that we need theory to influence how we perceive all of this. As ecologists and as historians, we need models and theories. We are no different. Both of us are calling on the instrumentation of human modeling thinking capacity to really try and understand what's going on. Some of us use instruments, some of us use other kinds of indicators, but we all theorize about what's going on, and it's all getting more and more complicated as we move from the immediately observable into the really interesting stuff, which is about the complexities of the past. So complications. I'll just give you a few quick examples of how historians make complicated matters. One of the established notions of the past is that probably indigenous populations have a better handle on ecosystems than the modern Western world will have. And of course, that has been very often said, and we can quote like this, that there is this notion of a sacred relationship between people and the animal world. And I'm not denying this, but I would question that that sort of human perception actually has been powerful enough to actually guide them to govern better their own resources, better than we do. Because to them, just like to us, the human ocean spectrum is hidden. They only see what they see. They don't see the effects. They don't see the complications. And therefore, some of them will live in abundant ecosystems where even a little bit of whaling will not really change the ecosystem. And others, like the Caribbean Indians, will live in ecosystems where actually you can take out, just by collecting queen conch for human nutrition and selling some of the queen conchs as iconic symbols. Some of the queen conch have been discovered by archaeologists deep into the Amazon. So that's an indication of how far-flung this pre-Columbian Indian food culture actually was. But they had no notion of the impact. But if you, as archaeologists do, dig through these heaps, you will realize that the bottom queen conch is much larger than the top, simply because they were fishing down the food system. Of course, the turtle population of the Caribbean has been, or is, severely endangered today, but again, as Jeremy Jackson did, if you go through the nesting sites, you will realize that some of the nesting sites were actually taken out by pre-Columbian Indians. And in New Zealand, the fur seal population, of course, was badly hit by the Europeans when they arrived, but way before that, they had been exterminated from the North Island by the Maori, who had arrived, of course, by the 1250s. So that kind of human-animal interaction is an ongoing story, and probably as historians we need to be very careful about how we interpret cultural interpretations of sustainability. We certainly need the hard evidence and not just the declared intentions. Long-term change is a really complicated thing to get your handle on. Here's one fantastic time series of 1600 years of oceanic pelagic oscillations from the Californian ecosystem. You have these sediments which have been building up with the fish dying, being deposited on the seabed, and if you count the scales of the fish, you will get an approximation of how many fish died in that water column over centuries. So if you have enough PhD students to slave away, as Bob Francis did for this, you can have 6 PhD students worth of evidence here to build up 1600 years of evidence of pelagic populations. That's fantastic, but how to interpret it? Well, the immediate interpretation is that natural oscillations are huge, and very clearly as you analyze it using climate theory, you will realize, yes, a lot of this is driven by climate. Of course, the really contentious bit is this last bit, the one that we humans have observed, the collapse of the Californian pelagic fisheries in the 1940s. Huge collapse, which probably was the very first collapse which induced the growth of the new discipline of fisheries economics. Fisheries economics was the marriage of biology and economics to try and establish what was the reason for the collapse here. And they worked out that this was overfishing. And of course, if you look at it now, you will say, well, what about natural variation here? Clearly, that's also part of the picture. It's a bit of both, of course, because the interesting thing is that although you have a spike here, pelagic populations have not rebounded as they have in the past, so probably overfishing keeps down natural variability to a low minimum. So here we have a complication which sort of explodes the easy notions of overfishing. On the other hand, introduces natural variability as a big unknown, and therefore really raises the question every time we look into evidence of overfishing or change. Well, do we really have enough information? In Northern Europe, we have an amazing discovery. in the early medieval period, people around Northern Europe were really eating, as far as they were eating fish, they were eating freshwater fish. They were eating fish coming out of rivers. That's established by means of the fish bone that have been dug out in urban settlements. But as we look into the development around the 11th century, suddenly we see more and more herringbone. By the 13th century, we start to see cod bone, and then a little later, in the 13th, 14th century, we get these deep sea fishes. That's an indication that Northern Europeans experienced what James Barrett called the fish event horizon, sometime around the year 1000, 1050. Humans in Northern Europe decided we want marine fish. Why did we do that? We don't know, really. It took an enormous effort, because certainly in order to catch these, you need decked vessels with 10, 12 men on board. You will need to do voyages of 3 or 4 days in perilous waters, and you will need to develop a complicated trading mechanism. In order to establish this, there needs to be a trigger. Maybe, as some have indicated, we just want fish, and we had depleted the European rivers and we turned into marine resources, but we really don't know. So that's one of the big mysteries for historians in the future, is what's driving us? Why do we choose to fish? And thinking outside of that box, why is it that the Japanese are totally into fish and Latin Americans are totally into beef? Those food cultures are really questions that need to be understood much better than we do today, because that's really important. We shape the landscapes by what we eat, by what we choose to eat, and we shape the oceans by what we choose to eat. And sometimes we give up. Another mystery which is awaiting historians is, why on earth was it that around 1600, 1650, a lot of coastal settlements, again in Northern Europe, that's the area I know best, suddenly were deserted? We gave up on fishing. Some will say, well, clearly that's because we were no longer Catholics. Therefore, we don't need to eat fish. That's the Protestant Revolution in the landscape. Well, it's not a bad theory. However, if you analyze the human diet, you will see that actually we continued eating fish well after the Protestant Reformation. It was only in the 17th century that we really gave up on fish. So that was a bit too late, because we turned Protestant by the 1520s. So clearly there's another cultural explanation here waiting for a good historian. And finally, to end down here, what about teleconnections? The big global connections. And this is for Jody. You talked about the Mr. Hamburger yesterday, who told his neighbors to come to Australia for the good oyster fishery. Well, I'm not saying that he was coming, because we need to research that. Yeah, but it is striking, isn't it, that this guy was living, he was coming from a territory which had a collapse of oyster fishery in the 1870s, which followed on from another collapse which had happened much earlier in southern territories of the Wadden Sea, the North Sea Bight. So he certainly had an experience of collapse, which may have induced him to say, well, go south. Yeah. Another teleconnection is the export of British food culture to to Australia. Of course, the fish and chip culture is absolutely fundamental to British working class culture. And Australians needed to absorb that food culture as well, but you didn't have the good haddock and the ships that would provide you with all the stuff that you want to batter. So therefore, by the First World War, you imported these big buggers and launched them onto a pristine ecosystem. The trawlers, within a few years, hit the Southeast Australian waters, and this picture, I'm sure, will be familiar to many of you. It is really one of the best examples of what I'm trying to say here today. That within the course of a few decades, the onslaught of British trawlers or British type trawlers in Australian waters totally changed the ecosystem of Southeast Australia. Whereas in the 1920s, these flatheads were really dominating the catches and made for excellent battered food. Within a couple of decades, they were getting much less plentiful and eventually were almost extinguished from Southeast Australian waters. And you then discovered that there were other food sources, and you adjusted your tastes to that. So not only are we looking at an ecological regime shift, but you're also looking at a human cultural change of behavior and food system, which is absolutely staggering. So ending, and I realize that I've tried your patience now for too long, I need to end by some perspectives. So if we have all this historical information, should we try and use that for any thoughts about the future of the ocean? Should I really, as a historian, be concerned? I would say that history certainly provides a better understanding of the past. It may also provide baselines for management, certainly for fisheries management, maybe also for human coastal settlements. It's certainly information that will provide with information about why did we choose to settle where we do, how did that settlement develop, what's the human capital invested in those coastlines, and what should we be aware of as we change our coastlines. And we may even use this historical information to empower people in their choices as consumers and citizens. A lot of us will be very concerned about the future for the ocean, and we will be driven by alarmist feelings. That's very understandable, but alarmism makes us understand very little and act in panic, and therefore we need to combat any excuse for alarmism. So I want to introduce you to three ways of talking about the past and the future. Here's one, the optimistic version. We can use the history of degradation to tell us about what could be recovered if we understand the past. We can use it as an alarmist wake-up call and say, well, the future will be the rise of slime. Or we can use it for the rational message of Hilborn that we humans really need to take a balanced approach. We can allow overfished stocks to regenerate, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. So we need to take a precautionary measure, do not destroy habitats, but we will perhaps need to allow single species to go commercially extinct because we also need the food. Now, looking back on those three images, I would say, as a historian, I would love if this was true, that humans were rational. But I know we are not. This is not a good recipe because we always use excuses as a very good, rationality as a very good excuse for behaving irrationally and irresponsibly. So I would say, be very careful. On the other hand, I hate pessimism, so I would go with the optimistic image. But really, as a historian, I think we as humans are really at sea. We don't really know what's going on. We are not really managing anything really wisely. So probably what is happening is pretty much what he's experiencing. We are sort of trying to muddle through, and perhaps that's the best approach. When we eat, we cannot always remember the whole food system, but we should try at least to have a precautionary measure to what we order from the menu. We don't need to be driven by our reptilian brain. We can allow our frontal lapse to really inform us and make some choices, as long as we don't kid ourselves that we can control everything. There's good evidence that humans actually will behave reasonably sensibly. Here's a very recent Eurostat barometer. They interviewed 25,000 people across Europe, and 88% of Europeans actually believe that biodiversity loss is a problem. That's good news. Humans are not stupid. But we need to have concrete, actionable advice and not be preached to, and we certainly react very badly to alarmist provocations. So the challenge of the future is how do we address this? And that's a cognitive problem. It's not a question of information. We have all the information we need. The real challenge is cognitive. How do we inform and inspire and motivate people to change tack? That's the real problem. And perhaps we can do it really simplistically, and that's perhaps my take-home message. Make it simple. There is a very simple choice between a Mediterranean diet and a Northern European diet. It's healthy, and it's actually in many ways much more aesthetically appealing, and it's better for the ocean. It's better for the climate if we don't eat all that beef. So perhaps that's a very simple message that we could be carrying across, as long as we don't get into excesses about the marine food culture, because of course there are limits to what we can do, as I opened by stating. So we really need, as consumers, to think, and we historians and ecologists can inform people to empower our choices as we go to the supermarket, and actually I think that's where the action starts. Thank you.